Hello, you're watching Reams of Eames, a channel where I discuss military-related topics and tactics. Please remember to rate, comment, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you can be notified of new videos. As you can probably tell from the title, war is a racket. Today we'll be taking an objective look at the cost of the global war on terror, then tying that into how I believe we can fix the war racket. This took me weeks to make. I hope you find it interesting and learn something along the way. We're going to cover some difficult topics here, but these are topics that are essential to discuss. If you feel yourself getting upset, just pause the video, take some breaths, maybe go for a walk. But I hope you'll come back when you're ready. I'll be waiting for you. Now on to some legal stuff. The views expressed in this presentation are mine, and they are mine alone. They do not reflect any opinion or view of the United States government, the Department of Defense, any branch of the American Armed Forces, or any entity other than myself acting as a private citizen. Nearly all of my data has been collected from primary sources, and they will be linked in the description below. Let's break down the topics we're going to discuss. We'll define what a racket is and tie the definition into our discussion. We will then examine how much money we're dealing with and who profits most from the American way of war. Next, I'll show you who pays for the racket. However, I'm pretty sure you know about 50% of the answer. I'll then recommend how we break this racket, and go into quite a bit of detail into the reforms I suggest. This is Major General Smedley Darlington Butler, retired Marine Corps. His book, War is a Racket, published in 1935, was my inspiration for conducting this research. I wanted to take some of his mindset and apply it to the wars that I took part in. He starts his book like this. War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small, inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. If you've not heard of Butler, look into him. He won 2 Congressional Medals of Honor and lived to tell the tale. As promised, let's define what I mean by the word racket. The dictionary defines a racket as an illegal or dishonest scheme for obtaining money. We're going to focus on the dishonest part of that definition because, believe it or not, war profiteering is 100% legal in the United States. In our defense industry, and by defense I mean any form of legal military action, the operations of corporations are subsidized by the federal government and they make massive profits from human suffering. This, to me at least, makes war in our defense industry a racket. Before we go into who profits from war, we have to find out how much money we're dealing with. Take into account that this is one account and it only includes numbers from the top 100 corporations that were subsidized each year. Numbers expressed here do not include spending for the paying of our service members, Veterans Affairs, TRICARE management, or defense threat reduction. It is just from the federal account number 9700. What you will see frequently is people reporting nominal spending, which is $4.3 trillion. Nominal spending refers to a rate that has been unadjusted for inflation. In my opinion, nominal spending is reported for 2 reasons. Either the person reporting it doesn't know what it means, or the person is attempting to shroud something. Now let's take a look at real spending. $5.4 trillion to the top 100 corporations from one account. Real spending is relative to the time it's calculated. It's used to demonstrate the actual cost as well as the true purchasing power of the currency. You may be looking at all these numbers and all the commas and be trying to imagine what $5.4 trillion looks like. Don't even try. John Borwin, an applied mathematician at the University of Newcastle in Australia, says that numbers like this are far too enormous and that no human being is intuitively equipped to understand them. It's safe to say that our human brain can't fathom it. These numbers were so big that the .gov website used to calculate inflation would not work. Think about that for a second. Not that it really matters, but let's look at the commanders-in-chief during the global war on terror. From 2001 to 2008, we have President Bush of the Grand Old Party. From 2009 to 2016, we have President Obama of the Democratic Party. And from 2017 to 2020, we have President Trump from the Grand Old Party. Now I want you to look at the scatter plot and compare 2005 and 2020. Nominal spending would have you believe that more was spent in 2020 than in 2005. Compare that to the real spending, and you see that when we're discussing currency, it's always better to use real currency as opposed to nominal. It keeps things transparent. I think I've made my point on how much money we're dealing with. Now let's look at the top 5 corporations that benefited from the global war on terror. Coming in 5th place, we have Raytheon Technologies Corporation, coming to a wedding near you. The Department of Defense has subsidized them with nearly $310 billion from 2001 to 2020. At 4th place, we have the Northrop Grumman Corporation. They were subsidized with nearly $320 billion between 2001 and 2020. They made unmanned aerial vehicles and systems, space systems, and a few information gathering technologies. And they were also the leaders in herbicide warfare in Afghanistan, which sort of reminds me of Agent Orange from a certain other conflict. At 3rd place, we have the very sleek General Dynamics Corporation, who has subsidized over $330 billion from 2001 to 2020. They make our armored vehicles such as the Abrams main battle tank, as well as submarines, missiles, and signal systems. Now in 2nd place, we have the Boeing Company, subsidized with over $500 billion during the GWAT. They make some aeronautics platforms, intercontinental ballistic missiles, space systems tech, and they also do systems repairs because their stuff is sometimes far too complex for the Department of Defense service members and contractors to conduct maintenance on them. Now we have the big kahuna. The Lockheed Martin Corporation was subsidized with nearly $800 billion from 2001 to 2020. Geez Louise, Lockheed, if you are watching, please pay off my mortgage. They make some very advanced aeronautics platforms, missiles, and space systems. They also conduct systems repairs for the same reason that Boeing does. You know the top 5 corporations profiting from the war, but who runs these corporations? Who are the ever-elusive they? Here they are. The executives, CEOs, VPs, and other leaders of Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon. Now you see their faces. Why am I showing you this? When I started to learn about war profiteering, I was on my 2nd deployment to the Middle East. After I learned about these corporations, I hated them, and I mean hated. But it was weird. When I looked at the leadership for each corporation, like their faces, I didn't feel anything. Nothing at all. They're regular people just like you and me. Although, they come jam-packed with a lot more privilege than your everyday American. Here's where it gets interesting. This is all open source data, but it was still challenging as hell to find and aggregate. So we're going to talk about the Boeing Company, which is just one of the war profiteers, and what I consider to be their lobbyists whom have numerous conflicts of interest. Boeing has thousands of lobbyists, but these ones are particularly interesting. Every single name you see here, over 420, are people who have lobbied Congress on behalf of the Boeing Company and, get this, have served in a position within Congress as a staffer or someone who had something to do with running the federal government. Do you see those names highlighted in red? Those are former congressmen who were hired by lobbyist firms and Boeing. Pretty sweet deal for them. Many of the names you see that are not highlighted in red are currently serving in Congress. Remember that Boeing was subsidized with over $500 billion from 2001 to 2020. But let's look at how much they expended in their efforts to lobby our Congress. Just a little over $340 million. That's a pretty good return on their investment. Take a look at the average American median income per household for each class of society. And yes, I said per household. What I'm trying to tell you here is something you already know. You pay for the racket. You, small businesses, and sometimes, even a corporation or two. But what about the 1%ers? Senator Sanders is always going on about those pesky 1%ers. Well, they don't really pay taxes like regular folks. Dr. Melissa Sartor and Kathleen Swed from Accounting Degree Reviews cite the most frequent ways the top 1% avoid taxes is through real estate borrowing, life insurance borrowing, payments in kind, shell companies and tax havens, etc. Turns out, Senator Sanders was right. So we know the kind of money we're dealing with. We know who is getting the profits, we know who pays the bills, but the bill for something is not always a good representation of what I think is the true cost. This bar graph represents the low end of those killed in the global war on terror. It's based on a massive study conducted by the Watson Institute for Internal and Public Affairs at Brown University. I know it's sort of hard to understand, so let's look at some hard numbers. 7,052 U.S. military. Some of those people were my friends. We have DoD civilians, over 8,000 contractors, nearly 15,000 troopers from allied nations, over 200,000 Iraqi, Pakistani, Afghani, and Syrian service members as well as police. The most considerable amount is from civilians, numbering over 360,000 dead. These were non-combatants, and people who had no choice in whether or not they lived or died. We have nearly 700 journalists and media workers. They gave their lives while trying to make sense of a war no one could possibly understand. Nearly 1,000 humanitarian workers were killed trying to make hell just a little bit better of a place. And finally, nearly 300,000 opposition fighters. Whatever God you believe in, if you believe in a God at all, we come from the same one. I don't accept nor do I tolerate the ideologies of our opposition, but I respect their status as warriors. I'll leave it at that. Nearly 1 million humans are dead. And remember, these are the conservative numbers. This doesn't include people who committed suicide when they returned home, or people who died of exposure, dehydration, or disease because their world was ripped away from them. Human beings are the actual cost. Money, honestly, it's made up. It doesn't exist on the elemental chart. Humans are material. They exist. They were birthed. They smiled. They cried. Scraped their knees. They felt fear. They fell in love. Some chose to fight. None of them will grow old. Not all of them have graves. None of their families will ever be whole again. Okay, that was pretty rough, and I hope you're still with me. We know the system is broken, but that doesn't mean we should just burn everything to the ground and start over. It doesn't mean we don't need a system. That isn't realistic, nor is it beneficial to anyone. A 2013 Security Council report found that peace resolutions and parlays are pretty much worthless. So I think we can rule those out as an option to fix anything. I presented you with what I consider to be problems, and now I want to make a few recommendations to fix the issues. Each reform that I suggest will build on another. We need to outlaw lobbying by people who have served in the government, as well as outlaw those who have been lobbyists from running for or being appointed to any federal office. We need to install term limits for all branches of the federal government, which I believe will crack down on corruption. We need to amend Article 2 of the Constitution. If you don't know or can't remember what that is, don't worry, we'll be going over it. We need to change the eligibility criteria for the draft and do away with exemptions and deferments. We need to simplify our voting system. We need to nationalize our national defense. We need to repeal the archaic Armed Forces Anti-Unionization section of the U.S. Code. And we need to limit peacetime reach of our armed forces. I know these recommendations may seem radical, but really, they're not. Change is necessary if we want to fix this mess, and believe me, it needs fixing. So just hear me out. Remember that section on the Boeing Company's lobbyists? Well, that's a problem. It's a conflict of interest that only helps a few people and ensures that corporations profit from war. The corporations max out their donations to politicians, which just compounds the issue. I have 2 points to make with this recommendation. My first point, if a person has served in the federal government, they should not be allowed to lobby. That is a conflict of interest. On to point 2. Suppose you have ever lobbied on behalf of a corporation. In that case, you need to be barred from serving in the federal government. And I'd actually go as far as to bar those folks from ever acting as staffers within Congress. I get that not all lobbying is bad. I just think most of it is. Suppose a policymaker lacks knowledge of a policy they are being asked to write. In that case, I understand lobbying might make sense. However, I still believe it would be better for lawmakers to leave Washington, D.C. every now and again and go speak to the masses they wish to police. The second reform, and one I imagine would be pretty popular, is establishing term limits. The Pew Research Center has reported that as of April 2021, 76% of Americans do not trust our government. I believe that this is because they've been given countless reasons to distrust the feds. Alright, let's start with Congress. Currently, there are no term limits. You may be thinking, if the people of a congressperson's state don't want them, they'll just vote them out. That's possible, but it's highly unlikely. Once a person gets into government, it's hard as hell to get rid of them, sort of like carbon emissions. After they secure power, they have all the funds they need to book a re-election. Money is usually the best indicator of who will win an election. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. I recommend limiting the House and Senate to 2 terms each at 4 and 6 years respectively. That's long enough to make a change. The presidency. No change here, I just want to complete the picture I'm trying to frame. The Supreme Court. No one should be allowed to hold any sort of office for life. That's ridiculous and goes against what I believe a democracy or a republic represents. Here's why. Society and that society's beliefs are constantly changing. Most of our Supreme Court justices are relics of generations that no longer represent the majority of the United States. They need to be voted in by the masses, not appointed by one person. 2 10-year term limits are long enough. Let's talk about the Commander-in-Chief. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 of the Constitution gives the President the title of Commander-in-Chief, making them the de facto person in charge of the armed forces. In the words of Kanye West, no one man should have all that power. I believe the title of Commander-in-Chief should be bestowed upon our legislative branch. A pluribus unum. In a time of war, many voices will speak as one, on behalf of the people. I also recommend that we build on the War Powers Resolution of 1973. We need to limit the justifications for war and define in plain language what the definitions of those justifications are. Any use of force conducted by our nation needs to be discussed by the established bodies to represent all of the United States, not one person. Furthermore, any act of violence involving our armed forces needs to begin with a formal declaration of war and have tangible goals that represent the desired outcome of said war. The idea that Americans can fight on another nation's sovereign soil with no declaration of war is just bananas. But I also think that our Congress should not have the final say. I have more to add on this point though. Let's get a little controversial for a second. The Selective Service System, better known as the draft. Currently, all males ages 18 to 25 must register for the draft. This just isn't right, and for a lot of reasons. By not being inclusive, we cut our lottery pool for the draft by 50%. I propose that we include our female and non-binary populations in the draft. Non-binary and females exist in our nation. They have much to offer our armed forces within the realm of combat and combat service support. I believe the age range should be 21 to 28. Suppose an American is not old enough to smoke tobacco or drink a margarita. In that case, they are not old enough to be ripped apart by an improvised explosive device. We need to limit the exemptions granted when the draft is activated. Mitt Romney got out of Vietnam on a religious deferment. President Trump got out of it because of bone spurs. President Biden's exemption was due to asthma. President Clinton got out of Vietnam by acquiring an education deferment. Rush Limbaugh received a medical exemption due to his anal cysts. John Wayne got a family deferment and did not have to serve in World War II. Whether the facts of these deferments are true or not, they are not right. All these deferments do is make war a poor man's gig. That is not right. If a person cannot serve in combat, I get that. It is a very demanding sport. They don't have to serve in battle, but they can still dress a wound. They can still weld steel or repair a vehicle among hundreds of other support roles. These people benefited from living in the United States while others in their generation died. A poor man's life is just as valuable as a rich man's. Remember when I said a formal declaration from Congress would be needed to start any conflict? Well, I also said that I had more to add. The Americans we ask to fight should collectively have a voice on whether or not they fight the enemies of our nation. It's controversial, but if war is to be fought, it's usually easier if the ones fighting it have a choice in the matter. An abstract concept, I know. So I've talked a lot about voting, and I think we need to fix it for any of the reforms that we've discussed so far to work. Our system is broken. Let me show you. Following the 2020 census, the Census Bureau reported that we have nearly 232 million citizens who are 18 or older. Over 5 million felons cannot vote, which is stupid, but that's a discussion for another time. With these stats, we can conclude that we have over 226 million citizens who can vote. But only a little over 168 million registered to vote, and not all of them even voted in 2020. 32% of our population did not make it to the polling booth for one reason or another. That's bad, but voting in the U.S. is a hassle, especially for minorities who face excessive obstacles. Voting must be simplified. At the age of 18, you ought to be able to walk into any government building, state or federal, and be registered to vote with no bureaucratic barriers in place. I'm also a big supporter of being able to vote from your phone or your laptop. Since I became an adult, I have always done my taxes on my phone. And if I can pay my taxes from my phone, I ought to be able to vote from my phone. I want to share some more statistics to show you why voting is so important. Let's look at the presidential election of 2020. Less than 1% of our adult population voted for one of 32 candidates or decided to circle the none of the candidates option, which, I'll give it to you, is a pretty sassy move. Less than 1% of the population voted for Mr. Hawkins of the Green Party. Less than 1% voted for Dr. Jorgensen of the Libertarian Party. 32% voted for President Trump of the Grand Old Party. And about 35% of our adult population voted for President Biden of the Democratic Party. 81 million adults decided who would run their country out of a total of 256 adults. We have to make voting easier. Okay, if you thought the draft reform was controversial, then this one will be even more so. If you feel that nationalization hinders innovation, then you're not exactly correct. Capitalism isn't very good at innovating. It's just good at advertising. One thing people always point to is the iPhone when they talk about the wonders of capitalism and the technologies it produces. Still, nearly every piece of hardware and software that makes up the iPhone was researched and developed by a federal agency. Apple aggregated the technology into one device. That's all. The bottom line is this: if there is a need, then people will always come together to make it happen, be it through mutual aid or the manufacturing process. I honestly believe the killing blow to war profiteering is to nationalize the arming, overall equipping, and research and development of our armed forces. I'd recommend that we make an industrial branch of the military. It would cooperate with the existing branches to conduct research, development, and the entire manufacturing process for our military. This would be an excellent avenue for citizens to learn a trade as well as serve their country. But the raw materials for anything have to come from somewhere, and here is what I suggest. Congress, who would now be in charge of the entire military, would set a fixed value from year to year on raw materials the industrial branch requests. The creation of the fixed price would come from fair negotiations between the private sectors who conduct business within our nation's borders. There has to be some compromise between the public and the private sector. Section 976 of Title 10 prohibits any service members from unionizing and collectively bargaining with their superiors. I believe this is wrong, and it leads to a decrease in productivity and effectiveness within our armed forces. Let me show you some statistics from the last time we used the draft in the Vietnam conflict. Purposeful fratricide, better known as fragging, was a big problem in our armed forces in the Vietnam conflict. Fragging is when a service member kills or attempts to kill a superior with an explosive, which is usually a fragmentation grenade. The term fragging has come to represent any attempt at killing a superior by any means. In 1971 to 1975, the Department of Defense conducted an investigation and found 800 to 1,000 cases of fragging with explosives alone. The conflict lasted from 1964 to 1975, so they didn't even cover the entire thing. David Courtwright, a scholar at the University of Notre Dame, states in his 1975 book, Soldiers in Revolt, that fragging instances utilizing both firearms and explosives numbered more than 1,400 individual cases. William Hammond from the Center of Military History stated that the U.S. Army reported more than 70,000 soldiers had deserted in 1971 alone. Let me tell you how significant 70,000 soldiers are. Today, that's enough people to man 14 brigade combat teams in the U.S. Army. A BCT is the basic deployable unit in the Army. It's enough bodies to man nearly 32 regimental combat teams in the Marine Corps. Or it's enough people to crew 12 Nimitz-class aircraft carriers. I think it's safe to say many of our service members were not happy with the Vietnam conflict. Still, I believe these statistics tell a story of men who were unsatisfied with their leaders and had no way to get their voices heard. We can fix that. In 1977, the Comptroller General conducted research on 4 NATO nations at the behest of the Senate Armed Services Committee. The nations that were studied were the Netherlands, the Federal Republic of Germany, better known as West Germany, Denmark, and the Kingdom of Sweden. Each of these nations allowed service members of their armed forces to join unions. Nearly all findings were positive. The Comptroller General reported that by allowing unionization, the service members were able to collectively bargain, which objectively raised morale, increased recruitment, increased retention, and even enhanced the effectiveness of their militaries. The service member unions had no control over tactical decisions, and ultimately all decisions were decided on by unit commanders. Following this investigation, the Department of Defense found that although unionization had many benefits, they would not allow it in the United States military. The most obvious negative impact of unionization of military personnel in NATO European nations has been the lowering of military standards of appearance and decorum. Yes, you heard that correctly. The Department of Defense didn't like unions because men could grow beards and their uniforms didn't look good to them. What a bunch of silly little billies. I borrowed this reform from Smedley, and I think it's a pretty good one. Limiting the reach of our military during peacetime and repurposing of the resources of the NSA and CIA, as well as most of the other intelligence agencies. The thing that is in red are American lands and remnants of our colonial empire. Everything that you see in blue is recognized as the EEZ for the United States. I recommend that we limit peacetime training and patrols for all military branches to our national borders, our colonies, and within the confines of our EEZ, to include aerial forces. So you may be wondering, how would we gather intelligence on possible adversaries? I propose we disband the CIA and NSA. They were created by executive orders, and they can be dissolved by executive orders. I believe their assets could be repurposed to the Space Force and other branches of the military. The Space Force could conduct surveillance of possible adversaries using satellites outside the Kármán line. So we wouldn't have any 1960s U-2 spy plane incidents anymore. But you may be wondering, how would we conduct other forms of intelligence collection? We conducted intel operations before the establishment of the CIA and NSA, and they were pretty darn effective. Take Benjamin Franklin, who was the Harvey Weinstein of his day, but also pretty darn good at collecting intelligence. See, before we had covert agencies, we just had regular people and diplomats who reported on suspicious stuff. It was pretty effective. And we would have a whole lot less coups in South America and violations of privacy on the home front. Let's review. We need to outlaw lobbying by people who have served in the government, as well as outlaw those who have been lobbyists from running for or being appointed to any federal office. Term limits will crack down on corruption. We need to make Congress our commander-in-chief. Make the draft more inclusive. We need to simplify our voting system. Nationalize our national defense. Allow the armed forces to unionize. And we need to limit the peacetime reach of our armed forces. If you wish to see my sources, please check the description. You will find them in a PDF there. Also, what are your thoughts on these matters? What reforms do you want to see? Put them in the comment section below. Please remember to rate the video, subscribe, and click the bell icon. I hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.